Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The horizon bled amber and rose as Captain Elias Marrow guided the creaking vessel toward the forgotten dock of Greywater Point. 23 years he'd sailed these waters, and 23 years he'd learned that dawn was the cruelest hour. It showed you exactly what you'd become. The Marrow tide groaned beneath his boots, her hull scarred by storms and stupidity in equal measure. She wasn't much, but she was his, and that was more than most men could say about anything in this life. The air smelled of rotting kelp and old regret. Elias hadn't meant to come back here, to this skeletal pier that jutted into the Atlantic like a broken promise. Greywater Point was a ghost town now, abandoned after the shipyard closed 15 years back. The few houses that remained stood hollow-eyed and silent, their paint peeling like dead skin. This place had nothing for him, no supplies, no shelter, no reason to drop anchor. But the tide had other ideas, and Elias had learned long ago that fighting the ocean was a fool's errand. He secured the wheel and stepped onto the deck, his sea-weathered hands moving through the familiar routine of preparing to dock. The wood beneath his feet was warm from the rising sun, and for a moment he allowed himself the luxury of stillness. Then he saw them, 3 figures, slumped against the rotting pilings of the dock. At first he thought they were bundles of canvas or discarded fishing nets, but then one of them moved. A slight shift of shoulders, a turn of the head, and Elias felt his chest tighten. Women. 3 women, chained to the dock like cargo waiting for pickup. His first instinct was to turn the ship around. Whatever trouble had brought them here wasn't his concern. He'd spent 2 decades making sure nothing was his concern, keeping his world small and manageable, confined to the 53 feet of the Marrow tide and whatever horizon he happened to be chasing. Getting involved meant complications, and complications led to attachments, and attachments led to the kind of pain that made drowning seem merciful. But his hands didn't turn the wheel. His feet didn't retreat to the cabin. Instead, Elias found himself lowering the gangplank, his boots hitting the dock with hollow thuds that echoed across the empty water. Up close, the scene was worse than he'd imagined. The women were young, early 20s maybe, dressed in torn clothing that might have once been fine but now hung in tatters. Their wrists were raw and bleeding where the chains had bitten into skin. One of them looked up as he approached, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and something else. Defiance maybe, or just exhaustion so complete it looked like courage. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please don't leave us here." Elias said nothing. He wasn't good with words, never had been. Instead, he knelt beside the first woman and examined the chains. They were old, but solid, fastened with a padlock that had rusted in the salt air. He pulled a set of picks from his belt, a skill he'd learned in a Mexican prison years ago, and worked the lock until it clicked open. The woman gasped as the chain fell away, clutching her wrists as if she couldn't believe they were free. He moved to the second woman, then the third, working in silence while the sun climbed higher and the gulls began their morning arguments overhead. None of the women spoke. They watched him with those same exhausted eyes, and Elias wondered what kind of hell they'd been through to end up here, chained to a forgotten dock in a dead town at the edge of the world. When the last chain fell away, the women stood on shaking legs. They looked at each other, then at him, as if waiting for permission to believe this was real. Elias gestured toward the Marrow tide. "Ship's not much," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "But it's dry and it's safe. You can rest there until we figure out what's next." The first woman, the one who'd spoken, nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, and there was weight in those 2 words, a depth of gratitude that made Elias uncomfortable. He wasn't a hero. Heroes were clean-cut men with noble intentions and bright futures. He was just a man who'd made too many mistakes to count, and was trying to make fewer going forward. He helped them aboard, one by one, their legs unsteady on the gangplank. Once on deck, they huddled together near the mast as if afraid that separating would break whatever spell had delivered them from that dock. Elias disappeared below deck and returned with blankets, water, and a tin of crackers. Ship provisions, nothing fancy, but the women accepted them like they were gifts from heaven. As they ate and drank in silence, Elias noticed something that made his blood run cold. Each woman wore a ring on her right hand, simple silver bands, worn smooth with age. He wouldn't have given them a second thought except for one detail. Carved into each ring was a symbol he knew better than his own face. A marrow bone crossed with a ship's anchor. His family crest. The same symbol tattooed over his heart. The same design that had flown on his father's ship before it was lost to a storm 30 years ago. His hands started shaking. He turned away, gripping the ship's railing hard enough to feel splinters dig into his palms. It wasn't possible. His family was gone, wiped out by disease, desperation, and the sea's indifference. He was the last marrow, the final ember of a bloodline that had been sailors and smugglers for 6 generations. There was no one left who should have those rings. No one who had any right to wear his family's mark. "Where did you get those?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The first woman looked down at her hand, twisting the ring absently. "Our mother gave them to us," she said, "before she died. She said they would protect us, that family would always find family." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were the same storm gray as his own. She said to look for a man with a mark like a bone and an anchor. She said he would keep us safe. Elias felt the world tilt beneath him. Family. The word hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to grasp but undeniable in its presence. He'd spent 20 years running from the idea of family, convinced that caring about anyone was a weakness he couldn't afford. And now here they were, 3 women wearing his blood in silver on their fingers, looking at him like he was the answer to a question they'd been asking their whole lives. "What are your names?" he managed. "Clara," said the first woman, the one with the defiant eyes. "This is Margaret, and that's Anne. 3 sisters. 3 rings. 3 impossible connections to a past he thought he'd buried beneath enough miles of ocean that it could never surface again." Elias turned away, looking out at the empty horizon where sea met sky in a thin line of possibility. He should have kept sailing. He should have never dropped anchor at Greywater Point. But the tide had brought him here for a reason, and Elias Marrow had learned long ago that you don't argue with the sea. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "You'll stay on the Marrow Tide until we sort this out. But there are rules on my ship. You pull your weight. You respect the vessel. And you don't ask questions I'm not ready to answer. Understood?" The 3 sisters nodded in unison, and for the first time since he'd found them, Elias saw something like hope flicker across their faces. He didn't know if he deserved that hope, didn't know if he could live up to whatever expectations came with those rings and that shared blood. But as the morning sun burned away the last of the dawn mist, Elias made a decision that would change everything. He would try. The Marrow Tide pulled away from the dock as the tide shifted, carrying its unexpected cargo toward an uncertain future. And for the first time in 20 years, Captain Elias Marrow's ship felt less like a refuge and more like a home. The sisters adjusted to life on the Marrow Tide with surprising ease. Clara, the eldest, took to the galley like she'd been born to it, organizing the meager supplies and preparing meals that somehow tasted better than anything Elias had managed in years. Margaret, quieter than her sisters, spent hours on deck watching the horizon with eyes that seemed to be searching for something just beyond reach. Anne, the youngest, was the curious one, asking questions about every rope, every sail, every creak and groan of the ship, until Elias found himself explaining things he hadn't spoken about in decades. 3 days passed in careful routine. The sisters kept to themselves mostly, sleeping in the small cabin Elias had cleared for them, speaking in hushed voices when they thought he couldn't hear. He gave them space, unsure how to navigate this strange new arrangement. But the rings haunted him. Every time he saw the silver glinting on their fingers, questions clawed at his throat. On the 4th morning, as fog rolled thick across the water, Elias finally broke his silence. The sisters were on deck, Clara mending a sail while her sisters watched. He approached slowly, a cup of coffee in his weathered hands. "Your mother," he said without preamble. "What was her name?" Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. She exchanged glances with her sisters before answering. "Lily. Lily Marrow. She never married, or if she did, she never told us about him. She raised us alone in Charleston, working 3 jobs to keep us fed. She died 6 months ago. Cancer. Lily." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. His younger sister, the girl with wild curls and wilder dreams who'd been 14 when he'd left home, swearing he'd return rich enough to save them all. He'd failed. Sent money when he could, but never enough, and never returned. He'd convinced himself she'd be better off without him. that his absence was a gift rather than abandonment. She talked about you sometimes, Margaret added softly. Said she had a brother who sailed away and never came back. She didn't blame you. Said the sea takes what it wants and you can't fight it. Elias gripped his coffee cup so hard it should have shattered. 23 years of running, of telling himself that disconnection was strength, and all along his sister had been raising 3 daughters alone, waiting for a brother who never came home. The guilt was a living thing, crawling up his spine and settling in his chest like ballast. The chains, he said, his voice rough. Who put you in chains? Clara's expression hardened. Men our mother owed money to. Medical bills, mostly. When she died, they came for payment. We had nothing to give them, so they took us instead. Said we'd work off the debt one way or another. They were taking us to a ship heading south when something spooked them. Police maybe, or Coast Guard. They chained us to that dock and said they'd be back. That was 2 days before you found us. The rage that filled Elias was cold and old, the kind that didn't burn hot but settled into your bones and turned you into something dangerous. Men who would chain women to a dock deserved worse than anything he could do to them. But he'd learned long ago that vengeance was expensive and rarely worth the cost. They won't find you, he said simply. Not on my ship. Anne spoke for the first time that morning, her voice small but clear. Mama said family was everything. That blood protects blood. We thought those were just words, something she told us to make us feel less alone. But then you came. Elias looked at his nieces, 3 young women who carried his sister's strength in their eyes and his family's mark on their fingers. He'd spent half his life believing that caring about people made you weak, that attachment was a chain heavier than any iron. But standing there on the deck of the Marrowtide, watching the fog curl around the mast and feeling the weight of blood and obligation settle on his shoulders, he realized something. Maybe weakness and strength were the same thing. Maybe caring about someone enough to stay, to fight, to anchor yourself to them despite the risk. Maybe that was the bravest thing a man could do. Your mother was right, he said finally. Family is everything. I forgot that for a long time. But you're here now, and that means something. It means your crew. It means this ship is your home for as long as you need it. Clara stood, the mended sail falling from her lap. She crossed the deck and did something Elias hadn't expected. She hugged him, just wrapped her arms around his stiff, uncomfortable frame and held on like he was the anchor in a storm. Margaret and Anne joined her, and suddenly Elias was surrounded by the 3 pieces of his sister he'd never known existed, their warmth cutting through decades of careful coldness. He didn't know how to be an uncle, didn't know how to be family, but as the Marrowtide drifted through the fog toward waters unknown, Elias Marrow decided he would learn. For Lily, for the girls, for the idea that maybe it wasn't too late to be more than just a man alone on a ship, running from everything that ever mattered. The fog lifted as afternoon came, revealing clear skies and open ocean, and for the first time in years, Elias looked at the horizon and saw not an escape, but a destination. 2 weeks on the water changed everything. The sisters weren't passengers anymore. They were crew. Clara learned to read the weather and the color of the clouds. Margaret discovered she had steady hands for navigation, and Anne proved fearless in the rigging, climbing the mast like she'd been doing it all her life. Elias watched them transform from frightened women in chains to sailors with purpose, and something in his chest that had been frozen for decades began to thaw. But the ocean has a way of bringing secrets to the surface, and on the 15th day, everything shifted. They were anchored in a quiet cove off the coast of North Carolina, taking on fresh water from a stream that cut through the rocks, when Anne found it, a wooden box, buried in the sand near the waterline, worn smooth by tide and time, but unmistakably intentional. She brought it to Elias with hands that trembled. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in his sister's handwriting, each one addressed to him but never sent. Elias sat on the beach and read them as the sun moved across the sky, his nieces silent nearby. Lily had written about everything. Her pregnancy at 16 with a man who disappeared before Clara was born. The twins, Margaret and Anne, arriving 3 years later from a different father who'd promised marriage and delivered nothing. She wrote about working herself to exhaustion, about the girls' first steps and lost teeth and school plays he'd never seen. She wrote about cancer, about choosing treatment that might give her more time with her daughters over treatment that might actually save her. And she wrote about him. I don't blame you, Eli. One letter read, You were young, and the world was bigger than our little house could hold. I hope you found what you were looking for out there on the water. I hope the sea gave you what our family couldn't. But if you ever come home, if you ever find these words, know that I never stopped being your sister. And my girls, your blood, they're strong like you. Sailors in their souls, even if they've never touched a ship. If something happens to me, if I don't make it and they need help, they'll look for a man with our father's mark. They'll find you. Because family always finds family, even across all that distance and silence. The last letter was dated 2 weeks before her death. Her handwriting was shaky but determined. The debt collectors came today. They'll take the girls if I don't pay, and I don't have anything left to give. I told them about the rings, about the crest, about you. Maybe that was stupid. Maybe I put them in danger. But I need to believe that blood means something, that you'll find them or they'll find you. I need to believe I'm not leaving them completely alone. Take care of them, Eli. They're the best parts of both of us. Elias's hands shook as he folded the letters and returned them to the box. Margaret sat down beside him, her shoulder touching his in silent solidarity. She buried this box 5 years ago, Margaret said quietly. Made us help her dig the hole right here in this cove. Said it was a message in a bottle without the bottle, that the sea would bring you here eventually if you were meant to find it. We thought she was being romantic, you know? Telling stories to make the world seem more magical than it was, but she was right. You came. I should have come sooner, Elias said, his voice breaking on the edges. Should have been there. Should have helped her, protected you all. Clara knelt in the sand in front of him. You're here now. That's what matters. Mama knew you'd come eventually. She had faith in the sea and blood and whatever force brings family together when they're supposed to be together. You saved us from that dock. You gave us a home on this ship. You taught us to sail. That's not nothing, Uncle Eli. That's everything. Uncle Eli. He'd never been called that before, never imagined he would be. The word settled on him like a captain's coat, heavy with responsibility but somehow right. He looked at his nieces, these 3 fierce women who carried his sister's determination and his family's salt-worn resilience, and made a decision. We're going to Charleston, he said, standing and brushing sand from his weathered pants. We're going to your mother's grave and we're going to pay our respects. Then we're going to find the men who chained you to that dock, and we're going to make sure they never do that to anyone else. And after that, if you want, this ship is yours as much as it's mine. We sail together or we don't sail at all. Anne jumped to her feet, her young face bright with something Elias recognized as hope. You mean it? We stay with you? Family stays together, Elias said simply. I learned that too late, but I learned it. The Marrow Tide isn't much, but it's ours. All of ours. They buried the box of letters back in the sand, marking the spot with a cairn of stones so they could find it again someday. As they rowed back to the ship in the small dinghy, the evening sun painting the water gold and crimson, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in 23 years. Not happiness exactly, but close. A sense of rightness, of being where he was supposed to be with the people he was supposed to be with. That night, anchored under a ceiling of stars, the 4 of them sat on deck and Elias told them stories. About their grandfather who'd run rum during Prohibition. About their grandmother who could navigate by stars alone. About Lily as a girl, wild and brave and so full of life it seemed impossible she was gone. The sisters added their own memories, weaving their mother's voice into the salt air until it felt like she was there with them, approving, blessing this strange new family that had formed from chains and dawn and blood. The Marrow Tide rocked gently on the tide, and for the first time since Elias had found 3 sisters chained to a forgotten dock, the ship felt less like a vessel and more like what it had always been meant to be. A home. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. And sometimes, real was enough. They would sail to Charleston in the morning. They would face whatever came next together, because that's what family did. Even family that found each other late. Even family forged in salt water and second chances. The sea had taken so much from all of them, but it had also given them this, each other. And in the end, that was the only treasure that mattered. Charleston greeted them with humid air and the smell of pluff mud at low tide. Elias guided the Marrow Tide into the harbor at dawn, the same hour he'd found his nieces 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks that felt like a lifetime. The city sprawled before them. Church spires and historic homes. Tourists and commerce. A living, breathing place that had continued on while Lily had died. and her daughters had been chained and sold like cargo. The harbor was already busy despite the early hour. Fishing boats heading out for the day's catch, cargo ships being loaded with containers, tourists snapping photos of the historic waterfront. Life, relentless and indifferent, moving forward whether you were ready or not. Elias secured the Marrow Tide at a temporary dock, paying the harbor master enough cash to avoid questions about registration or inspections. Some things were easier handled in the shadows. They found her grave in Magnolia Cemetery, a simple headstone under a live oak dripping with Spanish moss. Lillian Marrow, beloved mother, it read. The sisters knelt and laid wildflowers they'd picked from the last cove they'd anchored in. Elias stood back, his throat too tight for words, until Clara reached up and pulled him down beside them. She'd want you here, Clara said softly. She'd want you to know we're okay now, that we found you, just like she said we would. Elias pressed his palm against the sun-warmed stone. I'm sorry, Lily, he whispered. I'm sorry I wasn't there, but I promise you, I'll take care of them. I'll teach them everything I know. They'll never be alone again. A breeze moved through the oak branches, scattering shadows across the grave, and for just a moment Elias could have sworn he heard his sister's laugh, bright and forgiving, the way it had been when they were children playing in the surf. Then it was gone, leaving only the sound of birds and distant traffic and his nieces breathing beside him. Margaret placed her hand over his on the stone. She used to tell us stories about you, she said quietly, about how you'd take her fishing and let her steer the boat even though she was too small to reach the wheel, how you'd carry her on your shoulders through the waves. She loved you, Uncle Eli. She never stopped loving you, even when you were gone. The words cracked something open in Elias's chest. All those years he'd told himself that leaving was mercy, that his absence protected them from his failures. But Lily had needed him anyway, had loved him anyway, had raised her daughters with stories of an uncle who sailed away but might someday return. He'd wasted so much time being afraid of connection, of loss, of the pain that came with caring. And for what? The pain had found him anyway, but so had something else. Grace, maybe, or redemption, or just a second chance he didn't deserve but would take anyway. They left the cemetery as the sun climbed higher, but their work in Charleston wasn't finished. Elias had made a promise on that beach in North Carolina, and he intended to keep it. Through careful questions in the right bars and a few strategic bribes, he found what he was looking for. The men who'd chained his nieces to that dock worked out of a warehouse near the port, a front for a debt collection operation that specialized in preying on desperate people with nowhere else to turn. The warehouse was exactly what Elias expected. Corrugated metal walls, no windows, security cameras that probably didn't work. He watched it for 2 days, learning the patterns, counting the men, understanding the operation. There were 4 of them running the business, plus a rotating cast of muscle hired for specific jobs. They took people's desperation and turned it into profit, and they did it with the casual cruelty of men who'd stopped seeing their victims as human. Elias didn't go in guns blazing like some Hollywood pirate. He was smarter than that, older than that, and more patient. Instead, he gathered evidence, photographs of transactions, recordings of threats made in parking lots, names and dates, and enough documentation to bury them. His nieces helped, Margaret proving surprisingly adept at tailing targets without being noticed, Anne charming information out of people who should have known better, Clara organizing everything into a case that couldn't be ignored. Then he walked into the police station with his nieces beside him and laid it all out for a detective who looked tired enough to actually care. Detective Morris was a woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen enough of humanity's worst to be genuinely surprised when someone walked in voluntarily with evidence of crimes they weren't obligated to report. "Why bring this to me?" she asked, spreading the photographs across her desk. "You could have just disappeared, left town and never looked back." "Because other people's sisters and daughters are still out there," Elias said simply. "Because these men won't stop unless someone stops them. And because my nieces deserve to know that the men who hurt them will face consequences." It took 6 hours of statements and questions, but by the time they left, warrants were being issued and the warehouse was being raided. Detective Morris walked them out personally, shaking each of their hands at the door. "You did a good thing here," she said. "All of you. That takes courage." "Is that it?" Anne asked as they walked back toward the harbor, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. "Is it over?" "It's over for them," Elias said. And it's over for you three. No one's coming after you now. You're free. Truly free. Margaret stopped walking, her shadow merging with his on the warm stones. What do you mean, you three? Where are you going? Elias realized his mistake immediately. Old habits, old assumptions. He'd been alone so long that he'd naturally assumed this was temporary, that once the danger passed, his nieces would return to land and normal lives and he'd go back to the sea alone. But Clara was already shaking her head. Her jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line he was learning meant she'd made up her mind. No, Clara said firmly. You don't get to save us and then disappear. You don't get to give us a home and then take it away. We're crew, remember? We sail together or we don't sail at all. Those were your words. You deserve better than a life on a worn-out ship with an old pirate, Elias protested weakly. You could go to school, get jobs, have normal lives. Families of your own someday. The sea is hard and unforgiving, and I can't promise you safety or comfort or any of the things young women should have. You're not old, Anne said, and the Marrow Tide isn't worn out, she's weathered. Like you, like all of us now. And who says we want normal? Normal got us chained to a dock. Normal got Mama working herself to death. Normal is overrated. Margaret took his hand, the silver ring on her finger catching the afternoon light. Mama gave us these rings and told us they'd lead us to family. We found you. But it's not just about blood or crests or names. It's about choice. We choose this. We choose you. We choose the ship and the sea and whatever comes next. Don't take that choice away from us. Clara stepped closer, her storm-gray eyes, so like his own, blazing with determination. You think you're protecting us by pushing us away, but you're not. You're just making the same mistake you made 23 years ago when you left Mama behind. You're deciding what's best for us without asking what we want. Well, we're not children. We're grown women who've survived things that would break most people. And we're telling you what we want. We want to sail with you. We want to be crew on the Marrow Tide. We want to be family. So stop trying to be noble and just say yes. Elias looked at his three nieces. Women now, strong and certain, marked by hardship but not broken by it. They weren't the frightened creatures he'd found chained to that dock. They were sailors. They were survivors. They were family. And they were choosing him. Choosing this life with full knowledge of what it meant. All right, he said, and felt something in his chest click into place like a lock opening instead of closing. All right, we sail together. But you follow my orders on the ship. You learn everything I teach you and you never take the sea for granted. She's beautiful and she's deadly. And respecting her is the only way you survive her. Agreed? Agreed, they said in unison. And suddenly they were hugging him again right there in the middle of a Charleston street with tourists walking around them, and the salt smell of the harbor thick in the air. They provisioned the ship with supplies that would last months, Clara arguing with merchants over prices while Margaret calculated their route, and Anne charmed the dock workers into helping them load cargo. Watching them work, Elias realized they didn't need him to survive. They'd have figured it out eventually on their own. But they wanted him there, and that was different. That mattered. That was everything. They also made other purchases. Clara bought herself a proper sailor's knife and a leather journal to record their journeys. Margaret invested in navigation equipment, a sextant, updated charts, a compass that actually worked. Anne found a ship's bell in an antique shop and insisted they install it on the Marrow Tide. Every proper ship needs a bell, she declared, and Elias couldn't argue with that. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they cast off from Charleston and pointed the Marrow Tide toward open water. No particular destination, no urgent mission. Just 4 people and a ship, and the endless possibility of the sea stretched out before them. The harbor gave way to open ocean, the city lights fading behind them until there was nothing but water and sky, and the sound of the Marrow Tide cutting through the waves. That night, Clara cooked a feast from their fresh provisions. She'd learned the ship's small galley like a concert pianist learns their instrument, somehow producing meals that seemed impossible given the limited space and equipment. They ate on deck under stars that seemed closer than usual, brighter, like the universe was paying attention. Anne brought out a harmonica she'd bought in town and played songs their mother had taught her, old sea shanties and folk tunes that had been passed down through generations of Marrows. Margaret produced a bottle of rum she'd been saving, and they toasted Lily, toasted the Marrow Tide, toasted themselves and their unlikely survival. To Mama, Clara said, raising her cup, who never stopped believing in family. To Uncle Eli, Margaret added, who gave us a home when we needed one most. To the Marrow Tide, Anne said. May she carry us safely wherever we're meant to go. To second chances, Elias finished quietly. And to the family we choose. They drank as the ship rocked gently beneath them, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. For a long time, no one spoke, content to simply exist in that perfect moment where everything felt right and possible and true. What now? Anne asked eventually, the harmonica quiet in her lap. Where do we go? Elias leaned back against the mast, fuller and more content than he'd been in decades. Wherever the tide takes us. That's the beauty of this life. The sea doesn't care about your plans. It only cares about whether you can adapt, whether you can read the signs and adjust your sails. We'll find work when we need it. Cargo to transport, people to ferry, maybe even some salvage work if we're lucky. We'll rest when we can, explore when we want, and keep moving forward. Together. Will we come back here? Margaret asked. To Charleston? To visit Mama's grave? Every year, Elias promised. On the anniversary of the day I found you. We'll bring her flowers and tell her about our adventures. She'd like that. She would, Clara agreed softly. She always loved a good story. Anne picked up her harmonica again and began to play, a slow melody that sounded like waves and wind and everything the ocean meant. The others listened, and gradually they began to sing. Words they half remembered from childhood, lyrics about sailors and storms and finding your way home. Their voices weren't perfect, but they blended together in a way that made the imperfections beautiful. 4 parts of the same song finally learning to harmonize. Elias thought about the man he'd been 3 weeks ago, alone and convinced that isolation was strength. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he'd left behind on that forgotten dock at Greywater Point. The chains that had bound his nieces had somehow freed him, broken open the armor he'd spent decades building around his heart. He'd set out to save 3 women, and instead they'd saved him, reminded him that being human meant connection, meant family, meant caring about something more than just your own survival. The Marrow Tide cut through the dark water, her course set by stars and instinct and the collective will of her crew. On her deck, a lone pirate who wasn't lone anymore sat with his 3 nieces, his family, and watched the night unfold. The rings on their fingers gleamed in the starlight. 4 pieces of the same legacy, 4 parts of the same whole. I have an idea, Clara said suddenly. For the ship, we should paint something on the bow, a name or a symbol, something that represents all of us. What did you have in mind? Elias asked. 3 stars and an anchor, she said. 3 for us, the anchor for you. Family holding each other steady. Elias felt his throat tighten. Your mother would have liked that. Then we'll do it, Margaret declared. Tomorrow in the daylight. We'll make the Marrow Tide truly ours. They talked late into the night, making plans and sharing dreams and slowly building the kind of shared history that turns strangers into family. Anne taught them the rest of the songs she knew. Margaret showed them constellations and how to navigate by them. Clara told stories about their mother that Elias had never heard, filling in the years he'd missed with details that made Lily real again, present again. Not just a ghost in a cemetery, but a living part of their new beginning. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them. The sisters retreated to their cabin, their good nights floating back to Elias on the salt breeze. He stayed on deck a while longer, watching the stars and listening to the sea, and feeling the ship move beneath him like a living thing. The Marrow Tide had been his refuge for so long, his escape from a world that demanded too much and gave too little. But now it was something else. Now it was a vessel carrying precious cargo, a home protecting the people who mattered most. Dawn would come again, as it always did. But this time, when light broke across the horizon and revealed what the darkness had hidden, Elias Marrow would face it not alone, but surrounded by the people who'd made his ship into something more than wood and canvas. They'd made it a home. They'd made him family. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure any pirate could ever find. Not gold or glory, but belonging. Not freedom from chains, but freedom to choose who you sailed with and what you fought for. The sea had given him back what he'd thought he'd lost forever, and he would spend the rest of his days earning that gift, protecting it, honoring it. The Marrow Tide sailed on into the night, carrying its crew toward whatever tomorrow would bring. And on the deck where 3 sisters had first stepped aboard wearing chains and terror, there was now only warmth and laughter, and the quiet certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. Home wasn't a place. It never had been. Home was the people you chose to weather the storms with. Home was family, blood, or otherwise. Home was here, on this weathered deck, under these endless stars. Home was the Marrow Tide, and the Marrow Tide was theirs. Captain and crew, uncle and nieces, 4 souls bound by blood and choice and the promise that family stays together, no matter how rough the waters ahead might be. The last thing Elias saw before sleep finally took him was the silver gleam of the rings on his niece's fingers, catching starlight like promises made and kept. And for the first time in 23 years, Captain Elias Marrow slept without nightmares, rocked gently in the arms of the sea that had taken so much but had finally, mercifully, given something back.